On the day of my granddaughter's 1-month celebration, my son brought home a woman holding the baby. I recognized her as the former receptionist of my company, who was fired due to an inappropriate relationship with my boss. My son insisted on divorcing for her sake, even at the expense of our newly born daughter. Fine, if love is so important to him, then I hope he can face the consequences. Mom, I have always regarded Liana as my sister, but the one I love is Serena. I looked at the 3 people kneeling in front of me and let out a cold laugh. Do you know about her past? Do you know how this child came to be? Serena trembled as she looked up at me and said, Chairman, it was President Xi who forced me. I am far from home and cannot afford to lose this job. Elias Hart looked at Serena with sympathy and gently held her hand. The guests were discussing amongst themselves, as such events were indeed rare. Just as I was about to speak, I saw Liana approaching with her daughter in her arms. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she was walking unsteadily. She had gone through a lot to give birth to her daughter. I quickly stepped forward to support her and comforted her, saying, Don't be afraid. Mama will help you. Elias looked at his wife and daughter, showing not a trace of guilt. Instead, a look of disdain appeared on his face. Elias, your daughter is celebrating her full moon today. What do you mean by bringing this woman here? Elias paused for a moment, looking somewhat guilty. He replied, Mom, it's because you've always disagreed and I had no choice. I quickly glanced at Liana. I did know about this when she was about to give birth, and I handled it at that time. Elias promised that he would cut ties with that woman and take good care of Liana and the child. However, once the baby was born, I devoted myself to taking care of the 2 of them, only for those 2 to reappear. Do you remember why your father and I got divorced in the first place? Elias glanced at me fearfully and quickly lowered his head, remembering. Then you should understand what I hate the most in my life. My son hurriedly came to me and said, Mom, but Serena is already pregnant. Don't you want a grandson? Liana's body swayed for a moment, and I quickly had someone take the child away before holding her tightly. Mom, Liana's words were not finished, and tears began to flow down her face. Don't worry, Mom promised your parents that she would take good care of you. I will never let anyone hurt you. Liana's father used to be my driver, but he passed away in an accident. Her mother was heartbroken over this and soon after passed away as well. As a result, Liana has grown up by my side. Liana, does it really make sense for you to pretend to be frail in front of my mother? You know I can't stand such behavior. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer and slapped her. You cheated during your marriage and still blame Liana. Mom, I interrupted him, and today I just want to ask you one thing. Is Elias really determined to be with her, even if it means losing his status as the heir of the Hart family? Someone who has lived a privileged life since childhood might only perceive poverty in terms of living in a small house, driving a cheap car, and wearing a regular watch. Elias glanced back at Serena behind him and nodded firmly, indicating that he only wants Serena for the rest of his life. I was so angry that I wanted to laugh, and I nodded, applauding their love. Elias, who was now kneeling on the ground, resembled Dex when he knelt before my parents back then. I looked at Serena and wondered, do you think the same way? Even if he has nothing, would you still be willing to be with him and have a child? Serena paused for a moment as her breath caught. She managed a faint smile, as if she thought of something, and immediately nodded her head. Elias and I are on the same page. Good, let's separate then. We can go to the civil affairs office to get a divorce in a month. I looked at Liana in my arms and thought, Liana, this kind of man isn't worth holding on to. Liana wiped her tears and said, Mom, I agree to the divorce. A look of disbelief flashed in Elias's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by joy. Since your love is so great, I have nothing more to say. Before I could finish, excitement was already shining in Serena's eyes. I will sever our mother-son relationship. The Hart family will no longer have you as their son. I will reclaim all the bank cards and properties under your name. Additionally, you have been fired. Make sure to tidy up your belongings at the company on Monday. Regarding the house you are currently living in, I am giving you a week's time to move out. The light in Serena's eyes completely faded. Unfortunately, Elias did not see it. Auntie, I want to leave. I will keep my distance from Elias, so please don't treat him like this. As Serena spoke, she attempted to stand up and take her son with her. Elias hurriedly stood up and pulled them back, whispering words of comfort. I watched quietly, not wanting to disturb their intimate moment. Serena said something in Elias's ear, and suddenly he turned to glare at me, saying, "Mom, I'm your only son. If you drive me away, don't regret it in the future." I interrupted Liana and told her that Elias could come back, but that woman could not return. Besides, would you still be willing to accept him after he comes back? Liana thought for a moment and finally shook her head. I held her tightly, feeling a bit relieved. Liana's personality is so gentle that it allows Elias to behave so recklessly. "Aunt, let me take you back," I said as I turned around to see Asher standing there. "Oh, Asher is back. He has been practicing law abroad for the past few years, and due to some special circumstances, he has come back less frequently in recent times." I was a bit surprised to hear that he was returning for his granddaughter's full moon celebration. I figured that when he comes back, I will likely be very busy. Asher glanced at Liana and asked her if she wanted to go to the hospital, but Liana shook her head. In the car, I notified my assistant to suspend all of Elias's accounts, including reclaiming the properties under his name. "Asher, how long are you planning to stay this time?" He glanced at me through the rearview mirror and replied slowly that he had no intention of leaving. After we got home, I instructed the maid to take down all the wedding photos of Liana and Elias, not just those in the bedroom, but also any others in the house. "Mom." Liana held onto my arm tightly. I sighed, "Silly girl. Is this really the time to cling to hope? If you keep fantasizing about that man, your life will only become harder in the future." Finally, Liana couldn't hold back any longer and cried while holding me. Asher sensibly stepped aside. "Go ahead and cry after you've let it out. Lift your head and look forward." Liana broke down, crying out, "Mom, I don't want a divorce. I really love Elias." I gently patted her back and said, "I understand, but think about it. During these years with Elias, how many mistakes has he made? Has he ever apologized to you? Liana, if it weren't for your unplanned pregnancy before marriage, I wouldn't have agreed to your marriage. You place too much importance on emotions. Elias is not the right one for you. Don't be afraid. Mom will always support you as long as you are strong. The path ahead will be smooth." Liana finally broke down and cried heavily, almost fainting. Asher carried her to bed. I sat by the bedside watching her twitch and hiccup in her sleep, feeling very heartbroken. Liana has spent an unknown amount of time with me, more than Elias has. I tucked her in with the blankets and then stepped outside. "Is she okay?" Asher asked me hurriedly as I came out. I glanced at him and realizing something, he immediately turned his head away. After sending Asher off, I finally relaxed, but I still felt a deep sense of sadness. Although Elias hasn't shown much promise, I have been dedicated to teaching him. He is my only son, and of course I hope he can take over the company. Unfortunately, he hasn't stood out in either his work or his character. This is my failure. I haven't educated him properly. So now I can only endure this pain. I lie in bed, looking at the crystal chandelier on the ceiling, feeling dizzy. I quickly get up and take 2 pills. Ever since my divorce, I have been suffering from depression, and when my emotions run high, I often experience uncontrollable reactions. At that moment my phone rang, and I opened it with a bit of anticipation. The call was from Assistant Joe, and I felt a bit down. Elias transferred 2 properties under his name to Dex 6 months ago. What? That kid. When the divorce happened, Elias had just graduated from middle school. His father was so furious about that woman laying a hand on me that it led to my grandfather's death. Elias knows all of this. Over the years, he has been secretly meeting with his father, and I have never interfered. He has also been secretly giving Dex some living expenses, which I chose not to address. I didn't expect him to be this bold. I called Asher to ask if we could get the house back. After hesitating for a moment, he told me that it was possible. I felt relieved. Asher is a reliable kid, and he has always kept his word since we were young. I handed this case over to Asher, considering it his first case after returning to the country. Actually, I used to think highly of Liana and Asher and even tried to bring them together. However, Liana only has eyes for Elias. When it comes to matters of the heart, I can't say too much, which has led to this complicated relationship. However, today I noticed Asher's behavior. It seems he still has some feelings for Liana. On Monday, as soon as I arrived at the office, my assistant came to tell me that Elias was waiting for me in my office. I pushed the door open and saw Elias standing there with a serious expression. "What's wrong? Do you need something?" Elias shot me an annoyed glance and said, "Mom, did you really cancel my card?" I raised my eyebrows and asked, "When have you ever seen me say something that didn't count?" He approached me with a pleasing demeanor and began to massage my shoulders, saying, "Mom, I know you were just trying to give Liana an explanation that day. You wouldn't actually ignore me, right?" I sighed and asked Elias, "How old are you this year?" He paused for a moment and then replied, 28. He then asked me if I had ever restricted his choices in the past 28 years. He didn't understand why I asked that, but he shook his head nonetheless. I said, "You didn't do well in school, and your performance at work hasn't been satisfactory either. Now, as both a son and a father, you're not meeting expectations. Honestly, I feel that you have failed in many ways, and I myself have many shortcomings as well. Elias is, after all, my son, and he understands me." He was taken aback and asked, his voice trembling, "Mom, do you know what I did for Dad?" A wave of pain washed over my heart, and I asked, "Do you remember how your father treated me back then?" He nodded. "In order to be with you, I endured 2 years before getting a divorce. You know what those 2 years were like for me. You haven't forgotten how your grandfather passed away, have you? Because of Dex, I've had to take medication for depression every day for the next 10 years. Now you've actually given the house I worked so hard for to him. How could you do this? Do you want to live with your father?" Elias didn't respond. "Did your father abandon the family back then, and now you are going to follow in his footsteps? It doesn't matter, it's your choice. Did your mother ever tell you that once you make a choice, you must bear the risks? There's no such thing as a free lunch in this world." Suddenly Elias walked over to me, looking angry, and said, "You just can't stand to see others in love because of your own pride. You have control over everything, but the one thing you can't control is my dad, and that's why you're so angry. My dad is right, you're just jealous of Serena." I looked at the person in front of me in shock. Could this really be my son? Is he the child I carried for 10 months with great difficulty and raised with such care? In that moment, I felt he was so unfamiliar to me. I told him that no matter how much money he had, no one would truly love him, which is why my dad left him. He let out a cold snort and slammed the door as he walked out. I stared intently at the door, my body trembling slightly and my fingers gripping tightly until they turned white. I wanted to stand up and tell the assistant that the meeting could begin, but I just couldn't move. My throat felt choked up, the corners of my mouth involuntarily twitched, and tears flowed down my cheeks like a bursting dam. "Elias, are you all right?" I lifted my head, wiped my tears, and went out to the meeting. Midway through the meeting, I received a call from home saying that Liana had committed suicide. By the time I arrived at the hospital, Liana was still in the emergency room. Asher was standing in the hallway, and I saw that his white shirt was stained red. My legs went weak, and I just sat down on the ground. Aunt Liana should be okay, right? I clutched Asher's arm tightly, as if holding on to the last strand of hope. "Asher, she really will be okay, won't she?" Asher helped me sit down in a chair, and nodded heavily. I stared anxiously at the emergency room, feeling a deep unease in my heart, as if it were being squeezed tightly. The wait in the operating room continued until the next morning, when the doctor finally emerged, looking exhausted. However, there was a glimmer of joy in his eyes, and I finally breathed a sigh of relief. My daughter was okay. The doctor nodded, his voice filled with excitement as he told me that she had been saved, but I needed to be careful not to let her get too excited. I nodded heavily in agreement. Liana's face was so pale it seemed almost transparent, and I held my breath, fearing that I might disturb her. "Aunt, please have a seat first." "Asher, how could she have committed suicide? She seemed to have figured things out these past few days. Asher looked at me. His mouth tightly closed and remained silent. I felt anxious had she met Elias. I stood up abruptly, feeling somewhat dissatisfied. I dialed Elias's number, and the music on the other end was loud, indicating that he was at a party again. He had quit drinking for a while when Liana was pregnant, but it seemed he had started drinking again. Hello. Elias's speech was slurred. Just how much had he drunk? Liana has just gone through a dangerous experience, and yet he is out drinking and having fun. What did you tell Liana? Do you want us all to feel heartbroken so that she can live carefree with that person? Elias was silent for a moment and then asked, What do you mean? What happened to Liana? The other party replied she committed suicide. Elias said angrily, If anything happens to Liana, I won't let you get away with it. When Elias arrived, he wasn't even wearing shoes. I didn't know how he found out that Liana was in this hospital. The smell of alcohol made me feel nauseous, and I said, Liana doesn't want to see you right now. Elias's eyes were red, and he pleaded, Mom, I want to see Liana. A wave of sadness washed over me. He looked at me as if he was begging, but what good would it do? Even if I regretted it now, it was meaningless. Liana had already suffered so much. She still hadn't woken up. Asher came over to explain that the doctor said Liana needs emotional stability right now, so it's better if you don't go over just yet. At that moment, Elias suddenly erupted in anger and pushed Asher hard. Caught off guard, Asher stumbled back several steps. What business is it of yours when it comes to our marriage? I said. Slap. I gave him a hard slap, using almost all my strength. His face instantly turned bright red. Have you had enough trouble? If it weren't for Asher, Liana would have long been gone from this world. Aren't you planning to marry Serena? Go on, and don't hurt Liana any further. Elias stubbornly remained in the corridor, unwilling to leave. By the time Liana woke up, it was already dark. Asher and I had stayed by her side, without eating or drinking, for an entire day and night. She saw that I was still smiling and said, Mom, I'm sorry to worry you. I held back my discomfort and shook my head, thinking that as long as you are okay, that's what matters. Her gaze passed over us and landed on Elias in the distance. Elias, I don't blame you, you can go now, just don't come back. Yet Elias still came 3 times a day, each time quietly checking in while Liana was asleep. Sometimes I notice him inquiring about Liana's condition with the doctor. I haven't been to the office these past few days, as I've been staying with Liana, worried about her emotional instability. After her near-death experience, she has gained a lot of insight and has become more open and cheerful, even starting to share some jokes with me. It wasn't until I handed the baby Eneen to her that she couldn't help but cry, repeatedly saying she was sorry. Elias is so enthusiastic that it naturally causes some discontent among others. When Serena arrived, Asher and I were confirming some procedures for reclaiming the house. Her belly was already quite noticeable, and with Elias not around, she didn't have to pretend to be weak anymore. Auntie, I heard that. I interrupted her saying, I can't accept being called Auntie. Serena seemed unfazed by my response. I heard that Liana is in the hospital, so I specifically made Soup to come check on you. Why be so sharp? Asher stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. Serena tiptoed to peek inside but saw nothing. Is this Liana's new boyfriend? He looks quite handsome. She rolled her eyes and smiled, saying, But with your youth and talent, how could you be interested in Liana, a woman with a child? Asher scoffed, wondering whom she was referring to. Serena's face instantly flushed with alternating shades of red and white as she stammered. You. She couldn't match up to us, and when she tried to force her way in, Asher stopped her. To everyone's surprise, she fell to the ground, clutching her stomach and shouting, I came to check on her out of kindness, and this is how you treat me. Help! My baby! She suddenly felt a sharp and clear sensation. Sure enough, a familiar figure appeared at the end of the corridor. Elias ran over and picked the person up. Before leaving, he turned back and shot me a glare, saying, Mom, you're being too much. Serena also stayed in this hospital. I didn't go to visit her. Instead, I asked Dex to check in on her. When he returned, he spoke very gently. In short, he said she was doing well and eating nicely. I chuckled coldly to myself. I originally just wanted her to stay as far away from Elias as possible. After all, no one can act their entire life, especially in front of those closest to them. Sooner or later, Elias will see her true colors. Who would have thought that she would take the initiative to bully me? Dex, go ask the hospital for the surveillance footage from that day. Dex nodded. Then he asked if there was anything Serena needed during her hospital stay, and he would try to meet her needs. If she needed money, he could give it to her as well. Dex felt a bit puzzled about why they were doing this. Just do as I say. If she asks, you can tell her it's to make up for our initial mistake. Dex nodded in agreement. There's one more thing. It's essential to request an invoice when purchasing items the next day. Dex came to inform me that Serena wanted me to compensate her 200,000 yuan. I chuckled softly, so this was all the courage she had, just 200,000. I had already mentioned that I would fulfill all her demands. Dex hesitated as he took out a check. Money can be given, but the terms must be clearly stated. This is her requested compensation, and we will meet her demands, ensuring it is clearly written in the contract. Dex was taken aback, but then he nodded vigorously in understanding. I handed the hospital surveillance footage to Asher. Being a lawyer, he is certainly more professional than I am. Throughout my life, aside from Dex, I have never been manipulated by anyone. As I passed by Serena's hospital room, I saw Elias peeling grapes for her. I felt a surge of discomfort in my heart. His mother, who had worked so hard to raise him, and his wife, who had given birth to his children, had never enjoyed such treatment. Just as I was preparing to sue Serena, Dex hurried over. Serena and Dex shared a close relationship. Dex explained that he had discovered frequent communication between Serena and himself during the 3 months leading up to Elias buying a house for Dex. This just happened to coincide with the time when Elias and Serena confirmed their relationship, which was quite a coincidence. I understood what Dex meant. He was far from honorable, and Serena was also difficult to deal with. I quickly called Asher, only to be surprised by Liana's voice on the other end. Liana was actually willing to go out for a walk. A weight lifted off my shoulders, so I didn't want to disturb them and just asked Asher to bring Liana back before coming to find me. In the evening, Asher arrived. Seeing the obvious joy on his face, I knew they were getting along well. Is it possible to retrieve Dex's house soon? Asher took a document out of his bag and said, I'm already in the process. I knew that Asher was the most reliable among these young people, and I didn't expect him to have all the materials ready. By next month at the latest, we should be able to reclaim the house. However, I looked at him and asked, Are you worried about Elias? Asher nodded. Don't worry. If he can wake up to reality in time, I'm still willing to acknowledge him as my son, but if he remains stubborn, there's nothing I, as his mother, can do. In fact, Elias has never understood things clearly. On the day we took possession of the house, I expected Dex to cause a scene at my office, but unexpectedly, it was Elias who showed up. He was filled with anger and disappointment, accusing me of my actions. I thought I would feel sad, but to my surprise, I had actually become numb. This wasn't the first time I had been betrayed by someone so close to me. The money you have was given to you by me, and without my consent, you gave it to someone I despise. It's only natural to ask for it back. Since you think I'm so malicious, I suppose you don't want money from someone like me either, right? I took the prepared documents from the drawer and tossed them onto the table. Sign here, I said. Elias hurriedly picked them up to read, and after a moment, he looked at me in shock. You're asking me to give up my inheritance. Isn't this your choice? I smiled, wondering why he felt so bullied by me. Can you really bring yourself to do this? I chuckled softly, realizing that it was you who abandoned me for your love and your father. With everything laid bare, there was no point in continuing the conversation. I waited quietly for him to make a decision. As time passed by, Dex sent a message saying that the house had been reclaimed. I saw Elias sweating profusely, hesitating without any encouragement from me. All right, I'll sign. The last trace of my resistance disappeared, and I thought to myself, you are very brave. Elias signed the document with flair, and when he finished, He looked up at me, his eyes filled with hatred. This is my son, whom I have raised with great effort. Well, never mind, every generation has its own blessings and this is his choice. When Dex returned and saw the documents on the table, he picked them up and then looked at me with concern. Elias, are you okay? I straightened up and replied, I'm fine. Just sell the house we got back. Okay, he said. Also, let's put Serena's matter on hold for now. Take care of all of Elias's money, and then announce that I have severed my mother-son relationship with Elias, and that all the assets will be donated to charity. Elias, is this really the right thing to do? I smiled and patted him on the shoulder, reminding him that it was just some news. Dex finally felt relieved. I wanted to see what Elias could achieve on his own. Since he wanted to completely distance himself from me, it was time to take back the advantages I had given him. As expected, less than a month later, Dex told me that Elias was struggling to find a job and facing obstacles everywhere. His education level is low, and his professional skills are limited. He barely managed to find a job but was fired before getting through the probation period. Serena is holding the compensation money I gave her, but she has no intention of spending it on Elias. Elias can't even afford cigarettes. He called Asher yesterday to borrow money, but Asher refused. The friends around him have long since left. Although Elias and Asher are cousins, their relationship has never been good. Asher stood out from a young age, becoming the exemplary child in the eyes of others, while Elias struggled to improve his grades despite countless tutoring sessions. As they grew up, Elias made some friends and believed he had a lot of them. He often belittled Asher, who worked hard, in front of me. Who did Serena give the money to? Dex thought for a moment and immediately went to investigate. In less than an hour, he returned and said that she had given Dex $100,000. I knew it. Dex's house had been taken away, and now he had no place to live. Serena had made a deal with him before. He would definitely want to seek her out. When we divorced, Dex had seen my methods and was too fearful to provoke me easily. You gathered all this information, including the details about her meeting with Dex, and sent it anonymously to Elias. All right. No matter what Elias is like, he is still my son, and I am willing to give him another chance. Unfortunately, my son always fails to see the situation clearly. He has been influenced by Serena's words, and is even more caring and gentle towards her. Hearing this, I was almost too stunned to speak. When Liana came in holding the baby, I found I didn't have much anger left. Mom, I shouldn't have worried you like that before. I truly regret it. When I heard her say this, I knew she was genuinely realizing her mistake. I gently held her hand and said, you mustn't do this again. Mom is getting older and can't handle this kind of shock. Liana nodded with tears in her eyes. You take the child home first. I still have some matters to deal with. Liana glanced at her daughter, who was nearly asleep in her arms, nodded again and then walked out. Due to the situation with Elias, I've accumulated a lot of work over the past few days. It seems I'll have to put in some extra hours. Around 3 in the morning my phone rang. I picked it up and saw that it was Liana calling. Hello. This is a police officer from Changshan Road Police Station. Liana and her child have been in a car accident. By the time I arrived at the hospital, Liana had already taken care of her injuries. How are things? The doctor explained that upon examination, there were only slight abrasions on Liana's forehead and wrist. Liana was still shaking uncontrollably. She was very anxious, especially since there were children in the car, which made her even more frightened. What about the children? She asked. The doctor reassured her that the children were fine as well. I helped Liana walk to the hallway, and only then did the police begin to explain what had happened. The other party was driving under the influence, but fortunately, my driver reacted quickly, avoiding a tragedy. I am truly grateful. He has been working for me for over 10 years, and this time he even saved Liana and the children's lives. Suddenly, I thought of something and asked the police, how old is the driver? The police pondered for a moment and replied that he is almost 60. He sustained a minor injury but insisted on not having a medical examination, saying he would cover all the expenses. Is he really refusing to get checked? I quickly called Dex to have him check on the driver. In the quiet hallway, I heard hurried footsteps. I looked up to see Asher. The panic on his face was quite rare. He didn't even have time to greet me before he rushed over to Liana. I sighed softly and quietly left. The next morning, Dex hurriedly came to tell me that the driver was his fellow townsman. Moreover, he had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and his grandson, who had just been born, had a congenital disability that required a significant amount of money for treatment. I took a few deep breaths to try to calm my emotions. I could only imagine what kind of deal he must have struck with that driver. Did Serena get involved in this matter? Dex shook his head, indicating that based on the current investigation, Serena was not involved. I had some doubts about this. After all, if she wasn't involved, how could Dex have money to give to the driver? Dex said he was looking into it further, and that time was a bit tight, so he could only find out this much for now. I shared everything I had learned with the police, and they were quite surprised, asking if I suspected anything. I nodded. He took a deep breath and said that we would conduct a thorough investigation. It is much easier for the police to investigate someone than for us. They quickly discovered that Serena had given Dex $50,000 before the car accident. However, there was no evidence to prove Serena's involvement unless Dex was willing to tell the truth. Serena's due date was approaching, and I was waiting for her to give birth. Otherwise, she might take this opportunity to evade legal consequences. A week later, the police arrested Dex according to the law. I also went to see Elias. It was our first meeting in several months. Elias had lost a lot of weight, and his dress shoes were quite worn out. Is there something going on? He still seems to really dislike me. You know what? Liana and the kids almost had an accident in the car. Elias's eyes widened in shock, his face full of surprise. How could this happen? So it turns out you actually care about their situation. Elias was taken aback for a moment and hurriedly asked what had happened. I glanced at him and explained everything that had occurred. Although he felt shocked, he didn't find it too hard to accept, until I mentioned that Serena was also involved. Elias slammed his hand on the table firmly and said it was impossible. She wasn't that kind of person. The day before the accident, she gave your dad 50,000 yuan. And in the end, all that money went straight into the driver's pocket. Elias still firmly believes that Serena wouldn't do something like that. If it were just your dad, he would only want to deal with me. Why would he go after Liana and the kids as well? Elias's expression showed some hesitation, but in the end, he resolutely denied it, saying, I believe in Serena, she wouldn't do that. I finally understood that no matter what evidence there was, as long as Serena claimed she was wronged, he would believe her unconditionally. I closed my eyes, completely losing hope in him. Let's just leave it at that. Soon after, I walked out of the cafe, and Elias hurriedly left as well after receiving a phone call. It was only when Dex called me that I learned Serena had given birth. When Serena finished her confinement period, I had Asher file a lawsuit against her for extortion. Before that, I decided to meet Dex. He had already been sentenced to 15 years, and when I saw him, I almost didn't recognize him. Dex looked me up and down, his eyes revealing jealousy and envy, as if he was laughing at me. Laughing at me? You almost harmed my only granddaughter. Can that be considered a joke? Dex rarely showed a guilty expression. He lowered his head and remained silent. You drove my father to his grave back then, and now you're trying to hurt my granddaughter. What have I done to make you hate me so much? Dex lifted his head. His eyes filled with confusion and helplessness. After a moment, tears started to roll down his cheeks. I don't understand why it has come to this. This wasn't my intention. He cried in agony, with tears falling one by one onto his pants. I observed coldly, people like him are not worth any sympathy. You and Serena joined forces to ruin Elias and his future. Are you satisfied with that? Dex shook his head frantically, saying, No, I didn't want to do that. It was that woman Serena who influenced me. I wanted money too much. So, you're suggesting sacrificing your own granddaughter to get the money? Dex looked at me in a panic and hurried to explain. No, it's not like that. Serena said you were all alone in the car, and that's why He realized he had misspoken and immediately stopped. I asked him, Then why don't you explain everything to the police? Dex lowered his head, determined not to respond any further. I continued, is it because Serena is carrying your grandchild that you are protecting her so much? Dex still didn't speak. What if I said the child isn't Elias's? Dex looked up in surprise. It was impossible. I didn't say anything more and left the police station with Dex. Obtaining the child's report wasn't easy. I could only try to persuade Elias. He was very sensitive to provocation, and before I could finish my third sentence, he was eager to prove to me that Serena was definitely not that kind of person. The report came out 3 days later, and the child was not Elias's. Before this, Dex had already found out that Serena had a boyfriend when she established her relationship with Elias. I was just making an assumption, but I never expected it to turn out to be true. Elias looked at the report in despair, repeatedly muttering impossible. I wasn't interested in his suffering and took the report to find Dex. Serena had done this to him, yet the grandson she was thinking about still belonged to someone else. During the appeal on Dex's case, I also took Serena to court. I thought everything was stable at that point, but I didn't expect my son to have another trick up his sleeve. He actually revealed everything to Serena in advance and even helped her escape. The police have temporarily been unable to locate Serena, and can only confirm that she has left the province. Elias must have told Serena about all this on the night he received the report. I was so angry that my vision faded and I fainted. When I came to, Elias was actually by my bedside. He knelt on both knees, looking earnest as he asked me to forgive Serena. I glanced at Liana behind me, my heart aching like a knife. Your own daughter was nearly harmed by her, and you seem indifferent to it all. Elias lowered his head and didn't answer, simply asking me to let Serena go. I sighed and signaled for someone to take him away. It was only today that I truly realized this son was a waste of effort. A week after her release from the hospital, Serena was arrested in a neighboring city. She was hiding at her ex-boyfriend's house, and when he heard that she had killed someone, he hurriedly called the police, which led to her capture. On the day of the trial, Elias waited outside, holding the child, swearing he would wait for Serena to come out. That night, he came to find me and bluntly said he would never forgive me in this lifetime. I looked at him coldly and asked if he thought I would still care about that. Elias scoffed, saying, "How could I forget? You don't care about anything but money." Despite all my preparations, he was still able to easily break through my defenses. This is the person I am closest to. Elias looked at the tears on my face, stunned. "Mom, just go and live your life well. I'll just pretend I don't have a mother like you, and you can think of yourself as an orphan." Elias's eyes gradually turned red as he tried to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything at all. The police station called, saying that Dex wanted to see me. Dex was very excited to see me. "You're here. I've heard that Serena has been captured." "Well, that's thanks to your help." He lowered his head, feeling a bit guilty. "No, it's me who caused you trouble." I said nothing and waited for him to explain why he had called me. Dex suddenly burst into tears. Once he calmed down, he asked, "Will you forgive me?" I frowned, not completely understanding his meaning. Dex continued, "I know I've caused you a lot of pain, but I still hope you can forgive me." I couldn't help but laugh, thinking that meeting him this time was really a waste of time. I stood up and said, "Forgive you? That's impossible for a lifetime." After saying that, I walked out. On my way, I stopped by to see Serena. She had cut her long hair, and she looked much more presentable. A cold smile played on her lips as she stared quietly at me. "You're remarkable for taking my son away, but you've also caused your own son to suffer. He lacked his mother's presence at birth, and will carry the label of son of a criminal in the future." Serena's expression softened a bit as she rolled her eyes and asked, "Do you really not want Elias as your son? He is your only child, after all." I nodded. "He is indeed my only son, but my life wouldn't change whether he existed or not." "How can you be so heartless?" I replied with a smile. "Heartless, really? I actually think you are more heartless, because you haven't seen the situation of Elias and your son. Elias has lived a privileged life since childhood, and has no idea how to care for a child. I just feel heartbroken seeing him so small and already so thin. If he finds out in the future that this life is caused by his mother, I wonder what he will think. Serena suddenly stood up and said, "You need to leave, I don't want to see you." She comforted herself, believing that the child was happy with Elias. I decided to expose her self-deception. In fact, a year later, Elias and I legally severed our parent-child relationship. From then on, my assets would no longer be inherited by him. He has no obligation to support me, and we have become completely unrelated. What brings me comfort is that my granddaughter is basically another version of me. She has been smart since she was young and remains calm and decisive when faced with challenges. Under Asher's guidance, she has grown into a kind and honest child. Oh, by the way, Asher and Liana obtained their marriage certificate a year later. Their relationship shows me what a peaceful and beautiful life looks like. When I turned 60, I handed the company over to Asher, and Dex accompanied me on trips around the world. It was like a long vacation for both of us.